In the heart of Fairview, a town so small you could hear the church bells no matter where you stood, there lived a preacher whose name carried more weight than the mayor's signature. Reverend Samuel Whitaker wasn't just Fairview's spiritual guide, he was its conscience, its healer, its bedrock. When crops failed, when marriages crumbled, when the grief of a lost child hollowed out a family's soul, it was Samuel who stood, steady, offering prayers that felt like armor against the world's cruelty. He had everything a man could ask for: respect, purpose, and a home brimming with laughter, or so it seemed from the outside. Inside the white-framed house, wrapped in ivy, a different story was festering. Samuel trusted two people with his life: his radiant young wife Lillian and the boy he had raised as his own, Marcus. They were his greatest blessings. They were his doom, because behind closed doors, beneath the soft murmurs of prayer and polished Sunday smiles, betrayal was taking root, poisoning not just a marriage, but a soul. A betrayal so profound, so grotesque, that when it finally broke into the light, it would shatter not just a man, not just a family, but the very soul of Fairview itself. It began, as most tragedies do, with a glance that lingered a moment too long, a hand brushing another in a kitchen too small for secrets. And it ended in the frozen woods of Carter's Hollow with a shotgun blast that echoed through the pines and a silence that would never fully lift. Because sometimes the greatest dangers aren't strangers lurking in the dark. They're the ones who kiss you goodnight. Fairview, in the fall of 1957, was a postcard of small-town America. Rows of cotton fields stretched toward a horizon broken only by church steeples and weathered barns. Dirt roads meandered between whitewashed houses, and the scent of burning oak drifted on the crisp golden air. In Fairview, people knew your grandfather's name, your grandmother's pie recipe, and every mistake your family had ever tried to bury. Appearances mattered. Reputation was currency, and no institution stood taller or holier than the church. At the very center of it all was Reverend Samuel Whitaker, tall and steady, with a voice like warm syrup. Samuel was the man Fairview leaned on when the ground trembled under their feet. He baptized their children, married their sons and daughters, and stood graveside when death came calling. His sermons weren't fire and brimstone. They were balm for the weary reminders that no matter how dark the valley, there was always a shepherd willing to walk them through it. Samuel's life was a testament to duty, faithfulness, trust, and so was his marriage to the outside world. Lillian Whitaker was everything a preacher's wife was supposed to be. 15 years, Samuel's junior. She was the picture of grace, petite, soft-spoken, always with a kind word and a polished smile. Sundays found her in pressed skirts and lace gloves, singing hymns with the choir, her eyes downcast in modest reverence. She was admired, envied, even the way women in small towns quietly envy the ones who seem untouched by hardship. They had no children of their own, a quiet sorrow that Lillian never spoke aloud, not even in whispered prayers. But their home wasn't empty. 12 years earlier, they had opened their arms to Marcus Whitaker, a scrawny, bruised boy plucked from a shattered home. Samuel saw something in Marcus: a second chance, a soul worth saving. He didn't just take Marcus under his roof. He baptized him anew, gave him his own name, and paraded him proudly through Fairview's narrow streets like a living testimony to God's mercy. Marcus grew up under Samuel's shadow, working the church grounds after school, sitting up front at Sunday service called a son by those who didn't know better, and smiled upon even by those who did. Inside their white frame house, with its ivy-covered porch and creaky floorboards, life ticked by in quiet, reverent order. Samuel rose before dawn to read his Bible by the same yellow lamplight his father once used. Lillian kept the house spotless, the flower beds blooming. Marcus mowed the lawn every Thursday afternoon like clockwork, the low hum of the mower a lullaby for the town. If there were cracks in the picture, they were hairline fractures, invisible to all but the most careful eyes. But something was changing. By 1958, Marcus was no longer the boy Fairview remembered. He had grown into a striking young man, tall, broad-shouldered, with a jawline sharp enough to draw glances even from married women behind church pews. When he tipped his hat on Main Street or leaned against the counter at the general store, more than one heart fluttered. He was still called the preacher's boy, but he was a boy no longer. And Lillian Whitaker noticed. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. No lightning strikes. No scandalous kisses whispered about behind Sunday bulletins. It began, as most disasters do, with something that looked harmless, a lingering glance. Across a kitchen table. A touch of a hand that lingered longer than necessary. And then conversations, first casual, then intimate compliments slipped into quiet moments, soft enough to seem innocent, sharp enough to leave a mark. For Marcus, who had spent his life carrying the burden of being Samuel's miracle child, the attention was intoxicating. And for Lillian, whose marriage had been a decade of dutiful smiles and polite silences, it was like stepping into sunlight after years in a windowless room. Marcus wasn't naive. Neither was Lillian. They both knew the line they were approaching. And when they crossed it, there were no protests, no tears, only a shared hunger for something forbidden, dangerous, and utterly irresistible. It happened while Samuel was away, preaching a revival 2 towns over, standing beneath a tent strung with bare light bulbs, thundering about sin, while back home sin blossomed beneath his own roof. In the dim lamplight of the Whitaker home, Marcus and Lillian shattered every vow Samuel had built his life upon. It wasn't tender. It wasn't even slow. It was desperate. 2 souls clinging to something that felt alive for the first time in years. And once the line was crossed, there was no going back. The affair between Lillian and Marcus was not a flame that burned out quickly. It smoldered, slow and steady, hidden beneath the polished veneer of Fairview's Sunday best. It was a secret stitched tight into glances across the dinner table, into fingertips that brushed too long against a forearm when passing the salt, into fleeting smiles traded when Samuel turned his back to tend the fire. At first, it was enough simply to know they were getting away with it. Enough to share something no one else could see. Something wicked and thrilling and impossibly theirs. They were playing with fire in a town made of dry timber, and somehow the danger only made it sweeter. But secrets like seeds do not stay dormant forever. They grow roots. They hunger. By late summer, the whispers in Fairview had begun. Not about Marcus and Lillian directly. Fairview folk were too careful, too polite, but about the Whitaker household. About lights burning late into the night, behind drawn curtains. About raised voices cut short too quickly. About Marcus, once so steady now, distracted and curt. Still no one dared say it aloud. Not yet. But inside the Whitaker home, the secret was no longer a secret. It was a firestorm. And fires need to be fed, or they consume everything around them. It was Lillian who first planted the idea, not in so many words, but with the kind of quiet suggestion that slips under a man's skin and lodges there. A comment about how Samuel had become cold. A whispered fear about how he could be harsh behind closed doors. A tremble in her voice when she said she felt trapped, invisible, forgotten. Marcus, already drowning in guilt over the affair, now saw himself not as a sinner, but as a savior. He wasn't sneaking around anymore. He was protecting her, saving her. Lillian never once said, "You have to do something." She didn't need to. She simply let the weight of their secret grow heavier and heavier until action felt inevitable. Meanwhile, Samuel remained blissfully unaware. He prayed. Before every meal, praised Marcus's hard work. To anyone who would listen, kissed Lillian's cheek every Sunday. Before they walked into church, hand in hand, he had no idea that the two people he trusted most were already quietly plotting his erasure from the world. The plan was simple. It had to be. In Fairview, nothing could be obvious. Everything had to look natural. Tragic. Yes, but natural. A hunting accident. That was the answer. Fairview men had been disappearing into the pines for generations. Rifles slung over their shoulders. Coming back days later with deer or tales of the one that got away. Accidents happened. Guns misfired. People slipped. No one would question a tragedy in the woods, and so the pieces began to fall into place. The annual Fairview men's hunting retreat was just weeks away. Samuel had gone every year without fail. This time, Lillian suggested that Marcus join him. It was perfect. No one would blink at the preacher and his son heading off into the forest together. And if something happened, something terrible, something heartbreaking, Fairview would mourn with casseroles and prayer circles, not suspicion. Lillian handled the details with a surgeon's precision. She urged Samuel to take the less-traveled Carter's Hollow Trail, citing rumors of better game. She made sure Marcus had access to Samuel's shotgun days in advance, under the guise of cleaning it for the trip. She packed their bags with an extra tin of biscuits pressed, Marcus's jacket herself, humming softly as she worked. Marcus moved through the preparations in a daze. There were moments, brief flashes when he hesitated, when he almost spoke. But every time he looked at Lillian, her soft smile, her trusting eyes, he convinced himself he had no choice. This was about protecting her, about freeing them both. And in Fairview, loyalty to family wasn't just a virtue, it was law. The morning of the hunting trip dawned cold and brittle. The sky, a bleached gray, stretched thin over Fairview like worn linen. Samuel loaded the truck with supplies, humming a low, tuneless melody as he double-checked the rifles. Marcus moved stiffly beside him, every muscle in his body taut with anticipation and dread. "We'll have a good time, son," Samuel said, clapping a warm, heavy hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Just the two of us. It's been too long." Marcus forced a smile so brittle it could have shattered with a whisper. Lillian stood on the porch, her arms wrapped around herself against the morning chill. She kissed Samuel lightly on the cheek, lingering a second longer than usual. Marcus caught her eye as he climbed into the truck. She didn't smile. She simply nodded, an almost imperceptible gesture that said everything. "It's time." They drove in silence. the truck rumbling along the dirt roads out toward Carter's Hollow, where the pine trees stood like sentinels, dark and watchful. The woods had a way of swallowing sound, of making men feel smaller, more alone, perfect for what needed to happen. By noon, they had set up a modest camp in a clearing beside a shallow creek. Samuel strung a line between two trees for hanging their gear. Marcus fumbled through his tasks, his hands clumsy, sweat slicking his palms despite the cold. After a small lunch of salted ham and dry biscuits, they agreed to split up, covering more ground. Samuel shouldered his shotgun with the ease of long practice, his posture relaxed. Marcus followed at a distance, the heavy weight of the borrowed shotgun burning against his palms. They trekked deeper into the woods, past gnarled roots and fallen logs, until they reached the crooked oak Carter's arm. The old hunters called it a tree bent and twisted by years of storms. This was the marker, the place where it was supposed to happen. Samuel knelt by a patch of disturbed earth, studying a trail of deer tracks. His back was turned. Marcus raised the shotgun. The barrel wavered. Samuel shifted the worn fabric of his jacket, pulling tight across his shoulders. Marcus squeezed the trigger. The explosion shattered the stillness. Birds screamed into the sky. Samuel jerked forward, crumpling face first into the frozen dirt. But he wasn't dead. A low groan escaped Samuel's lips as he tried feebly to push himself up, blood darkening the back of his jacket. Marcus froze, horror washing over him in a suffocating wave. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. It was supposed to be quick, clean, merciful. Samuel turned his head, his face contorted in pain, his eyes locking onto Marcus. And in that single, searing moment, recognition flickered. Not fear, not anger, just a terrible, aching sadness. Marcus stepped forward, shotgun trembling in his grip. One more shot. It had to be done. His fingers squeezed the trigger again. Another deafening blast echoed through Carter's Hollow. This time, Samuel Whitaker moved no more. For a long moment, Marcus stood rooted to the spot, breathing raggedly, the shotgun limp in his hands. Then, as rehearsed, he stumbled backward, forcing sobs from his throat, loud enough to be heard. If anyone had been close, which they weren't, he fired a third shot into the air, a hunter's distress signal, and collapsed by the truck, burying his head in his hands. He waited and waited until enough time had passed that no one would question his story. When he finally drove back into Fairview, his face was streaked with dirt and tears, his hands shaking on the steering wheel. He told the sheriff exactly what he and Lillian had practiced. They had gotten separated. He heard a shot. He found Samuel collapsed, the gun still clutched in his hand. A tragic accident, nothing more. And in Fairview, where people preferred simple tragedies over complicated truths, it almost worked. Almost. In the days following Samuel Whitaker's funeral, the town of Fairview wrapped itself in the rituals of mourning. The ladies of the church cooked casseroles and pies, stacking them in the Whitaker kitchen until the counters sagged under their weight. The men shook Marcus's hand with solemn grips and murmured words of comfort. They barely understood themselves. Children were hushed at the sound of Lillian's name, and the sanctuary pews were heavy with whispered prayers. On the surface, everything looked exactly as it should have. Grief, shock, tragic acceptance. But beneath it, something sour began to curdle. Marcus was coming undone. At first, it was small things. He forgot the words to familiar hymns. He fumbled at the store, knocking over displays. His once steady hands trembled when he filled the gas tank. People noticed. Fairview was a town where everyone noticed everything. And while they pitied Marcus, the poor boy who had lost his father in a cruel accident, They also started to whisper behind closed doors about how he flinched at sudden noises, about how he wandered the church grounds at night muttering to himself, about how he paused sometimes for long minutes staring at the pulpit where Samuel had once stood, so proudly. It wasn't just grief. It was something darker, something broken. One afternoon, a gas station clerk, someone Marcus had known his whole life, mentioned casually that Marcus had come in for a soda and ended up leaving without paying, his eyes glassy, his words slurred. Another neighbor, an old woman who lived 2 houses down, claimed she heard crying late at night from the Whitaker house. One wrenching sobs that made the hair on her arms stand up. Individually, these things might have meant nothing, but together, they began to weave a different story. And then came the anonymous call to the sheriff's office, a low, scratchy voice barely above a whisper. "There's something wrong with that Whitaker boy. You ought to look into it." The sheriff, an old friend of Samuel's, didn't want to believe it. He didn't want to dig up more pain, but duty gnawed at him harder than sentiment. He started small. He asked questions, quiet ones. Nothing official yet, just checking in, just seeing how folks were holding up. And everywhere he went, he found the same thing. Kind words about Samuel, careful, pitying glances when they spoke about Marcus, and an almost eerie uniformity about Lillian. She's holding up so well. She's strong. She's almost too calm. The sheriff's instincts, dulled by years of routine, began to sharpen. Too calm, too careful. Something was off. He pulled Marcus in for a casual conversation. Under the pretense of offering support, Marcus sat stiffly in the chair across from him, eyes darting around the room like a cornered animal. When asked about the accident, Marcus recited the same story, word for word, the one he and Lillian had practiced. It was too perfect. No grieving boy could be that rehearsed, not naturally. The sheriff didn't push, not yet. He didn't need to. He could see it in Marcus's trembling hands, in the way sweat pooled at his temples despite the cold air. Guilt doesn't wear well, and Marcus Whitaker was coming apart at the seams. As Marcus crumbled, the town's focus almost naturally began to shift. Whispers turned sharper, more daring. Questions that once only lived behind closed doors now floated on the wind. Outside the general store, lingered over coffee at the diner, slithered through Sunday sermons, and always circling back was the same unsettling observation. Lillian Whitaker wasn't grieving like a widow should. She attended every service, every community meeting, dressed in perfect mourning black, her veil just thin enough to show a face molded into the picture of heartbreak. But there were no tears, no tremors in her voice, only composure, controlled, calculated, too perfect. The sheriff noticed. More than that, he smelled it the way a hound smells smoke before the fire. So he shifted his questions, not at Marcus anymore, at Lillian. It started subtly. Simple communal conversations, gentle inquiries about how she was holding up, about her memories of that last morning. Samuel left for the woods, and it was in those small, careful conversations that the cracks began to show. Because Lillian, for all her planning, for all her icy discipline, made a mistake. She told the same story, word for word, to every neighbor, every deacon, every curious visitor who came bearing condolences, exactly the same. Not a word out of place. No natural hesitations. No conflicting memories. Too rehearsed. Real grief is messy. It stutters. It forgets. It contradicts itself. But Lillian's sorrow was a monologue polished to a shine. And once suspicion took root, it spread like wildfire. It wasn't long before other darker rumors began to seep out about how often Marcus and Lillian had been seen together in odd places behind the church, After choir practice, walking too close in the orchard paths behind the Whitaker home, about how, just weeks before the hunting trip, Lillian had been seen purchasing 2 sets of train tickets to New Orleans, one under her name and one under an alias no one recognized. About the late-night visits she paid to a farmhouse just beyond the county line property belonging to Robert Ashford, a former congregant who had left the church under complicated circumstances. The sheriff followed the trail carefully, methodically. He spoke to Tasha Holloway, Marcus's on-again, off-again girlfriend, who admitted tearfully that Marcus had changed long before the accident, that he had once drunk, and despondent muttered something about being trapped and wishing it was all over. It was enough for the sheriff to request a closer look at phone records. They revealed regular late-night calls between the Whitaker home and Robert Ashford's farmhouse. When confronted, Robert crumbled faster than Marcus ever had. Yeah, he confessed he and Lillian had been lovers. Yes, he confessed she had spoken of leaving Fairview behind, of starting over, without Samuel, without Marcus. Only herself and Robert. Robert swore he hadn't known how far she would go, that he hadn't wanted Samuel dead. But the damage was done. The sheriff had heard enough. This wasn't about a tragic accident anymore. This was about betrayal, layered, deliberate, and calculated down to the last breath. And as the final pieces began clicking into place, the last, most damning revelation emerged. In Samuel Whitaker's exhumed body, the coroner found trace amounts of a mild but steady poison administered over months. Not enough to kill him quickly, but enough to weaken him, slow him down, make him less likely to survive when the shotgun's blast finally came. Samuel Whitaker had been betrayed long before the first trigger pull in Carter's Hollow. The plot had been set in motion months before the fatal shot rang through the pines. Marcus Whitaker lasted exactly 3 days after the sheriff's quiet inquiry. 3 days of sleepless nights. 3 days of jumping at every knock on the door, every whisper of tires on gravel. 3 days of sitting alone at the edge of the bed where he used to pray as a boy. Hands clasped, mouth dry, staring into a darkness that offered no salvation. On the 4th night, Marcus drove without thinking, following roads he hadn't traveled in years deeper into the backcountry until he found himself at a sagging farmhouse on the outskirts of Willow Creek County. Mariah Collins, his biological sister, a name he hadn't spoken aloud in years. She opened the door to find him standing there, hollow-eyed, soaked with sweat despite the cold, looking every bit the ghost of the boy she used to know. She didn't ask questions. She just stepped aside and let him in. Marcus collapsed onto the kitchen floor, and for hours he said nothing. Not a word. Mariah, used to silence, simply sat nearby, waiting. It wasn't until the sun began to bleed over the horizon that Marcus spoke. In broken whispers, he told her everything. The affair, the betrayal, the gunshots, the plan that was never really his, though his finger had pulled the trigger. Mariah listened, without interrupting, without judgment. But when Marcus finished, when he sat trembling before her, she saw the truth in his eyes. He had already condemned himself. He didn't believe he could be saved. He didn't want to be. Still, Mariah knew what had to be done. That night, while Marcus slept fitfully on her worn-out couch, she made the call. By dawn, sheriff's deputies arrived at the farmhouse, quiet and heavy, with the weight of what they knew they were about to hear. Marcus didn't resist. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't even ask for mercy. Sitting at Mariah's battered kitchen table, cradling a chipped coffee mug between his trembling hands, he confessed it all again, this time formally. From the first lingering glance to the final pull of the trigger in Carter's Hollow, every lie, every whispered manipulation, and most devastatingly of all, he told them about Lillian, how she had wrapped him in her arms and in her lies, how she had turned his loyalty into a weapon against the only father he had ever known. How she had promised him freedom, only to have been planning to abandon him all along. The deputy's hardened men, used to farm disputes and petty thefts, sat in stunned silence. When Marcus finished, the only sound was the ticking of Mariah's old clock on the wall. Later that morning, under a gray, unfeeling sky, Marcus was led back to Fairview in handcuffs. Word spread faster than any official notice. By the time they reached the sheriff's office, the whole town already knew. Samuel Whitaker had not died by accident, and Fairview would never be the same. The warrant for Lillian Whitaker's arrest came down within hours. She was found exactly where they expected, sitting in the parlor of the Whitaker home, dressed impeccably in black hands folded neatly in her lap, as if awaiting judgment. When the deputies entered, she didn't scream. She didn't plead. She simply stood, smoothed the front of her skirt, and extended her wrists. The only flash of emotion was the faintest twitch at the corner of her mouth, as if she had known all along that this moment would come. In custody, she spoke no words of apology. She offered no defense. The investigators didn't need one. They had the phone records. They had Robert Ashford's confession. They had the letters, the train tickets, the hidden bank accounts. And now they had Marcus's full, shattering testimony. Lillian Whitaker, once the jewel of Fairview's Sunday mornings, was formally charged with conspiracy to commit murder, sexual exploitation of a ward, and fraudulent financial activities tied to Samuel Whitaker's accounts. The town, still clutching casseroles and prayer books, recoiled as if bitten. Because betrayal, when it finally speaks, does not whisper. It roars. The trial of Marcus Whitaker and Lillian Whitaker drew every soul in Fairview to the courthouse. Men in worn denim jackets, women clutching worn-out Bibles and purses, even the children too young to understand the full weight of it, sensed the air crackling with something ancient and terrible. Inside the courtroom, the walls seemed to pulse with the collective heartbeat of a town realizing it had been betrayed, not by strangers, but by its own. Marcus sat at the defense table, a hollowed-out shell of the boy Samuel had once raised. He spoke little. When he did, his voice was flat, drained of anger, drained of hope. The prosecution played his confession for the jury, word for word. There were no theatrics, no shouts, no courtroom drama, just the plain, devastating truth of a boy who had fallen into the arms and the traps of a woman who was supposed to protect him. Every detail was laid bare. The secret glances, the whispered promises, the manipulation, the hunting trip, and the moment, still raw, still bleeding in Marcus's mind, when he had raised the shotgun, not once, but twice, against the only man who had ever called him son. The jury didn't deliberate long. Marcus Whitaker was sentenced to 25 years in state prison with the possibility of parole after 15, not because the town forgave him, not because the court saw him as innocent, but because they recognized something more twisted, more tragic. He was a victim too, a victim of the woman who sat 3 feet away from him, hands folded neatly in her lap, lips pressed into a bloodless line. Lillian Whitaker's trial was colder, sharper. The evidence against her was suffocating. The letters, the bank transfers, the poison, the affair with Marcus, the second affair with Robert Ashford, the train tickets hidden under a false bottom drawer in her bedroom. When the prosecutor finished his closing arguments, there was a silence so deep it felt like falling into a well. Lillian offered no defense, no tears, no apologies. She stared forward, eyes like 2 polished stones, as the guilty verdict was read: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. When the judge asked if she had anything to say, before sentencing, Lillian stood slowly, her black dress rippling like smoke. She opened her mouth and then closed it again. She said nothing. Because what was there left to say? Fairview tried to move on. It stitched up the wound with potluck dinners and new paint on the church doors. It filled the pulpit with a fresh-faced young preacher who smiled too brightly and spoke too fast. But the scar remained. It lingered in the way people glanced nervously toward Carter's Hollow, in the way they spoke Samuel Whitaker's name in hushed tones, as if afraid the very earth might rise up and bear witness to their shame. The house where the Whitakers once lived stood empty for a long time. Weeds choked the porch. Windows grew cloudy with dust. No one wanted to buy it. No one wanted to tear it down either. It just stood there, a reminder, a wound, a prayer left unanswered. And sometimes, on cold mornings, when the mist curled low over the fields, the old folks swore you could still hear it, a single shotgun blast echoing faintly from deep within the woods, where sins go to rot and ghosts refuse to die.